In the aftermath of one of WWII's most daring rescue missions, U.S. Army medic Sergeant Frank Morrison faces an overwhelming reality at the Los Baños liberation camp. As he processes hundreds of emaciated prisoners, many weighing barely 72 pounds, his clinical detachment crumbles when he encounters a group of resilient women who refuse to be treated as helpless victims. What begins as a routine medical assessment becomes a clash between military protocol and human dignity, forcing Morrison to confront not only the horrors of war, but his own assumptions about strength, survival, and what it truly means to heal. Set against the backdrop of the Philippines' treacherous final months of occupation, this is a story about the thin line between saving lives and preserving souls. Laguna, Philippines, February 1945. 2 weeks after the thunderous airborne assault on Los Baños, a makeshift triage tent baked under the relentless tropical sun, its canvas stained with mud and the ghosts of memory. Inside, the humid air clung thick, a mixture of unwashed bodies, antiseptic, and the lingering scent of despair. Flies buzzed thick and relentless, drawn by the mingled smells of illness and the boiling rice rations distributed by the newly arrived American forces. The constant low thrum of distant mortar fire served as a grim lullaby, a stark reminder that Japanese holdouts still lurked across the dark waters of Laguna de Bay, shadows in the unforgiving landscape. The sound was not unlike a far-off drum, a primitive rhythm of lingering conflict, a heartbeat of unseen threat. It vibrated subtly through the earth, a faint tremor underfoot that never quite disappeared, a testament to the fact that peace, even for the liberated, was still a precarious state. Here, amidst the stench of survival and the promise of freedom, Sergeant Frank Morrison, a medic trained to heal bodies broken by steel and shrapnel, a man whose hands had skillfully sewn up gut wounds and packed compound fractures on countless battlefields, would confront the devastating math of starvation, only to find true strength measured in something far beyond mere pounds. What would you weigh after 3 years of hell? And what would you give to get back to who you once were? This question, unspoken but ever present, hung in the heavy tropical air, a phantom weight pressing down on everyone under the tent. The air itself seemed to remember the recent occupation, heavy with the silent fear instilled by years of brutal Japanese rule. The camp, though liberated, was still a cage of psychological scars, an invisible prison from which escape was proving far more complex than simply tearing down a fence. Morrison, moving between his makeshift stations, his boots squelching occasionally in the mud churned up by the previous day's downpour, could feel it in the hushed tones of the internees, in their quick, darting glances that seemed to scan the distant tree line for threats even now. He saw it in the way a sudden loud noise, a dropped metal basin, a shouted order from a supply sergeant, would send a ripple of terror through a queue of skeletal figures, their shoulders hunching instinctively, eyes widening in a primal fear response that spoke volumes of past trauma. The Japanese belief in absolute control, in the systematic dehumanization of their prisoners, had left an indelible mark. It wasn't just the physical emaciation. It was the way their bodies seemed to shrink from contact, the instinct to hoard even when surrounded by abundance, a deeply ingrained survival mechanism that screamed of deprivation. They were free, yes, but the chains of fear were still visible in their eyes in the way they shuffled forward, a strange blend of fragile hope and ingrained subservience. He saw it in the meticulously repaired rags they wore, clothing that had been darned and redarned until it was more patched than original fabric, each stitch a testament to stubborn endurance. He saw it in the forced politeness, a learned survival mechanism that still clung to them like a second skin, a habit of deference to authority honed in a place where a wrong word could mean a beating, or worse. The faint rhythmic beat, barely audible over the tropical insect chorus, could sometimes be heard from beyond the rice paddies. Was it a native drum, a celebration of the liberators, or something more sinister, a remnant of the Imperial Army's presence, still watching, still waiting, a shadowy presence just beyond the camp's perimeter? The fear was a tangible thing, a constant companion that permeated every corner of the makeshift sanctuary, a silent echo of the enemy's continued unseen. Vigilance, a subtle pressure on the skin, a tightness in the throat. Morrison wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, his fatigue a dull ache behind his eyes that threatened to split his skull. He'd processed hundreds already. Men with hollowed cheeks that made their teeth look too large, children whose bones seemed too sharp for their skin, their joints like knots in thin rope. Each weighed, examined, given a cursory diagnosis, a quick assessment that often felt grossly inadequate. He prided himself on his efficiency, his clinical detachment, the ability to compartmentalize the suffering, to treat bodies without succumbing to the emotional toll. This was a job, a necessary, brutal job. You couldn't save anyone if you broke down with every tragic case. "Next," he barked, his voice hoarse from hours of giving instructions, gesturing to the line that seemed endless, coiling outside the tent and disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. A woman stepped forward, or rather, drifted, as if held aloft by the humid air itself, her movements so slow and ethereal they defied gravity. Her form was impossibly thin, a living silhouette against the canvas tent flap, her frame so slight it seemed ready to dissolve into the tropical air. Her dress, once perhaps a modest floral print, now hung like a shroud, too large, too loose, revealing the sharp angles of shoulder blades protruding like nascent wings, the fragile jut of hips, the stark outline of ribs beneath the thin fabric. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, but her eyes held the ancient weariness of a centenarian, a wisdom born of enduring unimaginable hardship. Morrison, focused on the task, his mind already calculating caloric needs and likely vitamin deficiencies, gestured to the battered, field-issue scale. She moved slowly, carefully, each motion a deliberate act of will, as if each expenditure of energy cost her dearly, a precious coin from a rapidly emptying purse. He watched, pen poised over the stained, much-used medical chart, ready to record a number in the low hundreds, perhaps 90, maybe even 80 if she was truly bad. He'd seen worse, he told himself, though his stomach churned with a familiar unease, a cold knot tightening with each new skeletal form. This was a medic's burden. You adapted, or you broke. The needle on the scale wavered, then settled with a soft metallic groan. He squinted, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim, tent-filtered light. No, he knelt, tapping the scale gently with a gloved finger, convinced it must be faulty. He recalibrated, the small weights clinking softly. "Step aside, ladies," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone, a professional reflex, pushing a stray, sweat-plastered hair from his eyes. He motioned the woman back onto the platform. He watched, his gaze fixed, as the needle slowly, reluctantly, came to rest. It hovered precisely at 72 pounds. 72 pounds. He stared, then glanced at the woman. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, devoid of surprise, as if this number was simply a factual record of her existence, a statistic she had long ago accepted as her new reality. 72 pounds. It wasn't just a number. It was an indictment, a whispered accusation against the brutality of what she had endured. He felt a sickening lurch, a cold splash of reality that cut through his professional numbness, dissolving the careful walls he had erected around his emotions. He scribbled the number, the pen digging into the coarse paper, the ink bleeding slightly from his pressure. His mind, trained in emergency medicine, immediately conjured a snippet from a recent intelligence brief on POW health. Extreme malnutrition, borderline organ failure highly probable across adult female internees weighing under 80 kg. Immediate caloric repletion critical to prevent systemic collapse. He'd read it, nodded, filed it away. He'd understood the words, but understanding and truly seeing were two entirely different things. Seeing it, this woman, this living skeleton with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the entire Pacific Theater, it was a different beast altogether. He felt a flicker of raw horror, unbidden and unwelcome, a crack in his carefully constructed professional facade. "All right, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice a little softer, a little less commanding than he intended, the gruffness replaced by an involuntary tremor of concern. He began to list off the standard instructions, a litany of survival, high-calorie gruel, bland and thick, rehydration salts mixed with boiled water, limited movement to conserve precious energy. The woman nodded, a barely perceptible movement that cost her little, as if she had long ago perfected the art of minimal exertion. But as he reached for her arm, a gesture meant to guide her to the next station, a cot where she could rest. A sudden and subtle stiffness went through her. Her eyes, though shadowed by the deep hollows of her eye sockets, held a spark, a quiet refusal to be simply steered, to be treated as a passive object. "I can manage, Sergeant," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, if weak, a thin reed of sound against the tense canvas. She pulled her arm back gently, a delicate motion that lacked force but conveyed absolute certainty, then straightened her spine, a tiny act of defiance that belied her emaciated frame. Morrison paused, his hand hanging awkwardly in the air, a gesture left incomplete. He'd expected gratitude, docile passivity, the exhausted surrender of one who had suffered too much. Not this quiet assertion of self, this unwavering inner will. He frowned, his medical instincts clashing with something he couldn't quite name, a force he hadn't accounted for in his training manuals. "Your potassium levels must be critically low, ma'am," he stated, reverting to clinical authority, the familiar shield. "You need to follow my orders strictly. Your body is a wreck, a fragile thing that could give out any minute." She offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a ghost of a gesture that hinted at a wry humor long suppressed. "My body has been a wreck for 3 years, Sergeant," she replied, her voice now a whisper, barely audible above the insistent buzzing of flies. "And yet, here I stand. I learned to survive its wreck." She reached into a fold of her tattered dress, the fabric almost translucent from wear, and produced a small, water-stained fragment of paper. It looked like a page torn from a book, or perhaps a hand-copied recipe, filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting that spoke of careful conservation of ink and paper. "This is a list," she said, extending it towards him, her fingers so thin they looked like delicate bird bones. "A list of what we learned to grow, even in the camp's shadow, what little greens we could find in the ditches, how to stretch the rice. It's not much, but it kept us going. It might tell you something about what our bodies can tolerate, what they crave beyond your gruel." Morrison took the paper, surprised by its existence, by the raw audacity of its offer. It was a makeshift diary of botanical survival, a testament to ingenuity under duress, a quiet act of rebellion against the systematic starvation. He looked at her again, really looked. Not just a patient, a 72-pound statistical anomaly, but a person, a survivor who had actively fought for her own existence, not merely waited to be saved. The brief clinical observation on the paper, moringa leaf, 100 G size, 14 G protein, seemed to glow with a fierce, quiet power that belied its simple words. He recognized then that her strength wasn't just in enduring, but in actively adapting, in carving out survival from nothing. Her name, he now saw on the chart, was Eleanor Vance. He would remember it. His encounter with Eleanor Vance shifted something fundamental within him. He found himself paying closer attention, not just to the numbers on the scale, to the medical readings and caloric intake, but to the nuances of interaction, the subtle language of resilience. As he continued weighing and examining the endless stream of human wreckage, he noticed a subtle network of solidarity among the women. When one particularly weak stumbled, a ripple of quiet concern, a wave of empathy, passed through the queue. Another woman, perhaps a friend from the camp, would reach out a frail hand, a comforting gesture that required immense effort. Morrison observed these exchanges with a new lens. He saw women discreetly sharing information, a whispered caution about the bitter taste of the rehydration salts, a reassuring nod when one was particularly distressed or frightened. They were a community, not just a collection of individuals awaiting treatment, but a self-sustaining organism of mutual support. One elderly woman, weighing 75 pounds and suffering from a hacking cough that racked her entire frame, was being tended by a younger internee, barely 68 pounds herself, who gently pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, murmuring words of comfort in a low, soothing tone. "Please, Sergeant," the younger woman implored Morrison, her eyes pleading. "Can she get the special broth? She was always weak, even before the last drought. She needs something gentle." Morrison, charting their basic vital signs, began to notice a curious anomaly in his records. Despite nearly identical starvation levels, some women exhibited a far greater mental fortitude, a spark in their eyes that refused to be extinguished, a quiet determination that shone through the despair. He found himself scribbling notes on the margins of his own pad. Psychological resilience factor, higher among those who formed support groups? He tried to understand this, recalling the intelligence reports on prisoner psychology, how prolonged stress often led to complete breakdown to catatonic states. But here he was seeing adaptation, defiance, a profound will to persist. He wondered what unseen document, what shared resolve, what unspoken pact had kept their spirits from completely collapsing. Perhaps it was the tattered communal hymn book he'd spotted earlier, its pages worn thin from countless readings, tucked into the meager belongings of an older woman, Mrs. Aguilar. Its dog-eared pages hinted at shared prayers, defiance in song, a silent protest against the dehumanization, a way to keep faith alive in a faithless place. He started to understand that their survival wasn't just about individual will, but a collective spirit, a symbiotic relationship forged in the fires of shared suffering. It was a strength he hadn't been trained to recognize, a power he was only just beginning to comprehend. The women weren't just taking up space, they were holding space for each other. The requests became even more telling, pushing Morrison further beyond his clinical confines. Another woman, perhaps a former schoolteacher by the refined way she held her skeletal hands, stepped onto the scale. She was 73 pounds, a grim mirror of the first, another testament to the camp's brutality. After her assessment, instead of asking for more food or medicine, she looked at him directly, her eyes wide with a fragile hope. "Sergeant," she began, her voice a reedy whisper, almost lost in the general din of the tent, "is there any chance for a mirror, even a small shard, and perhaps a comb?" Morrison blinked, taken aback. A mirror? A comb? His mind immediately went to calorie counts, wound dressings, vital signs, the practical, immediate needs that screamed for attention. "Ma'am, we're focused on getting you healthy," he began, a flicker of irritation, born of exhaustion and frustration in his voice. "Cosmetics are not a priority right now. We need to get you stabilized." He was mentally calculating the logistical cost of such requests, comparing it to the desperate, overwhelming need for medical supplies, for basic sustenance. But the woman, whose name he now saw was Carmen Garcia, didn't back down. "It's not for vanity, Sergeant," she countered, her voice gaining a surprising firmness, a steel beneath the fragility. "It's to remember, to see who I am, not just what I've become, to recognize myself." She spoke of how, in the camp, the Japanese had systematically forbidden anything that might allow them to maintain personal dignity. Even a sliver of glass, if found, was confiscated, smashed. Even a comb, a simple implement, was deemed a luxury, a sign of defiance against the forced uniformity. She spoke of women sharing stories of their lives before, their identities, trying to keep them alive in their minds, to transmit their essence through whispered tales. She remembered a conversation, a hushed exchange in the barracks where a woman had whispered, "If we lose our faces, we lose ourselves. If we forget who we were, they truly win." It was about reclaiming herself, not just physically, but psychologically, clawing back a piece of her soul. Morrison suddenly saw the gaping chasm between his purely medical military perspective and their profound human experience. He looked at her thin, delicate fingers, the bones visible beneath the almost translucent skin, and imagined them trying to smooth phantom hair, trying to sculpt a face she could no longer see in any reflective surface. It wasn't about medicine, not in the traditional sense. It was about healing the soul, about stitching back together the fragments of self that had been systematically stripped away, piece by agonizing piece. His understanding of healing began to expand, reluctantly, beyond the purely physiological, beyond the simple mend of flesh and bone. It was becoming about the intangible, the essential spirit. Morrison, exasperated by a patient, Mrs. Santiago, who, despite being dangerously underweight at 69 pounds, steadfastly refused a particular nutrient-rich gruel designed for rapid caloric intake. She pushed the bowl away with a thin hand, her lips pressed into a tight, stubborn line. He argued with her, citing the dire consequences for her already weakened heart, her failing organs. "This is for your own good, Mrs. Santiago," he insisted, his voice sharp with fatigue and a mounting sense of powerlessness. "You need this. It's bland, but it's packed with what your body desperately requires." She merely shook her head, turning her face away, her refusal absolute and unyielding. A moment later, he overheard Eleanor Vance, the woman from his initial shock beat, gently comforting Mrs. Santiago, her voice a low, steady murmur, surprisingly resonant. "We survived their rules," Eleanor whispered, her gaze sweeping over the tent, taking in the American medics, the unfamiliar supplies, the sudden abundance. "We'll survive his food, but we choose how. We choose what we put into our bodies now. It is all we have left. The choice." The words, spoken so softly yet with such conviction, hit Morrison like a physical blow, a stunning revelation that resonated deep within him. We choose how. His assumptions, that these women were passive victims to be saved, fragile dolls to be mended and restored to their original state, shattered into 1,000 pieces. They weren't just objects of his medical attention. They were active agents, fierce survivors who had maintained a profound sense of self and control, even under the most brutal duress. Their defiance wasn't against him personally, not an act of insolence, but against the very concept of losing autonomy again. It was a quiet rebellion, born of years of having every choice, every morsel, every breath dictated to them by their captors. This was their new battlefield, a psychological one, fought with stubborn will and quiet refusal. His perspective shifted from purely prescriptive, from the rigid dictates of military medical protocol, to something more collaborative, respectful. The stark realization settled upon him. His mission wasn't just to save their lives, to keep their hearts beating and their lungs breathing, but to help them reclaim their right to live them, to make their own choices, however small, however seemingly insignificant. It was a heavier, more complex mandate than he had ever anticipated. The moral weight of his evolving understanding pressed down on Morrison, a burden heavier than any rucksack. He found himself grappling with an ethical dilemma that went far beyond battlefield triage, beyond the black and white decisions of life and death on the front lines. Here, in this makeshift tent, amidst the cries of children and the hushed prayers of the elderly, he was dealing with the profound, insidious damage inflicted not by bullets, but by systematic starvation, by psychological torture, by the deliberate, systematic erasure of identity. He reviewed another patient's chart, the alarming drop in hemoglobin, the skeletal frame, 71 pounds this time, the dangerously low blood pressure, the signs of edema creeping into the extremities. The biological fight was immediate and undeniable, a race against time and systemic collapse. But intertwined with it was a psychological war, a battle for the very essence of personhood. How could he, in good conscience, enforce strict medical guidelines that might further erode their hard-won sense of autonomy, their fragile grip on self-determination? He remembered Mrs. Santiago's refusal of the gruel, Eleanor Vance's quiet assertion of choice, Carmen Garcia's desperate plea for a mirror. He knew, intellectually, that every calorie counted, every nutrient was vital, that his primary duty was to restore their physical health. Yet what was the true cost of forceful intervention, if it reminded them, even subconsciously, of their oppressors, of a time when their bodies and wills were not their own? He recalled a passage from a pre-war psychology textbook, something about self-determination and recovery from trauma, a concept that now resonated with an unexpected visceral urgency. Trauma survivors regain agency by exercising choice, even in seemingly small matters, as it reestablishes a sense of control over their own lives and bodies. He found himself torn between the medic's unwavering oath to preserve life, to mend the broken, and the deeper humanistic calling to preserve dignity, to foster healing that went beyond flesh and bone. The irony was bitter, sharp on his tongue like a quinine pill. He was here to save them from a brutal regime that had stripped them of everything. But if he simply replicated the loss of choice, even with the best intentions, was he truly liberating them? He stared at his own hands, calloused from years of war, capable of both mending and, if he wasn't careful, breaking something far more fragile than bone, something invisible, but infinitely precious. This wasn't just medicine anymore. This was a battle for their souls, for their very humanity. And he, Sergeant Morrison, found himself fighting on two fronts, armed with both scalpels and a burgeoning understanding of the human spirit. The stats, the clinical data, the precise measurements of weight and blood pressure now felt cold, insufficient, sterile, They didn't account for the flicker in a survivor's eye when offered a choice, however small. They didn't measure the human spirit, which he was learning could weigh far more than any 72 pounds. It was a lesson being taught not in a lecture hall, but in the sweltering, fly-ridden heart of a liberated prison camp. The humid afternoon, already thick with the smells of sweat, earth, and medicinal alcohol, was abruptly shattered by a piercing scream from the children's section of the triage tent. The sound, sharp and high, cut through the usual drone of flies and quiet murmurs, instantly freezing every conversation, every movement. Panic flared, a sudden contagious wave cutting through the fragile peace. A child, perhaps 5 years old, was convulsing violently on a cot. Eyes rolled back, foam flecking his lips, his small body arching and twisting in terrifying spasms. Morrison's training instantly kicked in, his reflexes honed by years of battlefield chaos. "Status," he yelled, pushing past startled nurses and aid workers, his voice echoing with urgency. "What happened?" A young aid worker, her face pale with fright, stammered, pointing a trembling finger at an open can of fruit. He ate some of the new canned peaches, Sergeant. He seemed fine then. Then this." Morrison rushed to the child, assessing quickly, his gaze sweeping over the symptoms. Anaphylactic shock? A severe, delayed reaction to something his starved, delicate system couldn't process. Something foreign and overwhelming. The camp was already stretched thin, resources scarce, medical personnel overwhelmed. A mass allergic reaction, or any epidemic for that matter, could quickly spiral into an uncontrollable disaster, rekindling the terror of the Japanese era, when sickness meant certain death, when the weak were simply left to perish. He needed precise information, immediate action, and absolute calm. But the sheer volume of recently liberated internees made individual medical histories impossible to ascertain quickly. His mind raced, calculating dosages, considering possibilities, but every second was precious. Then he looked up and his eyes met Eleanor Vance's. She stood a few feet away, her face etched with concern, but her gaze was steady, discerning, analytical. She had a network. She had witnessed the subtle illnesses and strengths of her fellow internees for years. She knew their bodies, their histories, their sensitivities, in a way no American medic could. He made a snap decision, a radical departure from established protocol, an act of trust born of his recent revelations. "Mrs. Vance," he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic, sharp but not unkind. "I need you. Who else ate the peaches? Who has any history of sensitivities in the camp? Quick now!" Eleanor, without a moment's hesitation, sprang into action, her frail frame somehow commanding attention, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. She moved through the panicked crowd, her eyes scanning, assessing, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to other women. Within minutes, a small group of women, equally emaciated but sharp-eyed, had formed around her. They began to identify other children who had eaten the peaches, isolating them, watching for symptoms. They knew who had stomach ailments, who had hidden allergic reactions to certain plants they'd forage in desperation, who had always been weak. One woman, Mrs. Chen, pointed to a girl, pale but calm, who had shared the peaches. "She has always been strong, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice surprisingly firm. "But her sister, who passed last year, reacted badly to anything sweet, anything too rich." Another woman, Carmen Garcia, her face grim, spoke of how they'd learned to identify the warning signs of various illnesses, relying on each other when no medical help was available, when their Japanese captors would have simply let them die. Morrison watched, stunned and relieved, as these 72-pound women, once perceived as fragile patients, became his most effective, most intuitive medical assistants. They moved with purpose, speaking with quiet confidence, their knowledge of their community a powerful tool. He barked orders for adrenaline, for monitoring, for separating the exposed from the unexposed. He saw Eleanor coordinating, delegating, her years of survival leadership suddenly blossoming in a crisis that mirrored, in its chaos, the constant struggle they had endured. The tent, moments ago a swirl of uncontrolled panic, began to regain a fragile order, not through his singular authority, but through the collective, quiet strength of those he had initially seen only as helpless victims. The decision to trust them, to empower them, had turned the tide of chaos. He realized with a jolt that he hadn't just asked for information, he had asked them to lead, and they had. The immediate crisis passed. The child stabilized, breathing shallowly but steadily, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm of fragile recovery. Other potential cases were identified and monitored, their exposure managed, averting a larger, potentially catastrophic disaster. The camp, though still bearing the deep, indelible scars of its past, settled into a new, more collaborative dynamic. Morrison continued his medical rounds, his exhaustion still profound, but his approach was irrevocably changed. His perspective widened beyond measure. He no longer saw just patients, he saw partners in their own healing, collaborators in the arduous journey back to health and selfhood. He consulted Eleanor Vance and others like her on dietary adjustments, on the psychological comfort their community needed, on the small gestures that could make a world of difference. The 72-pound women, though still physically fragile, were gaining strength, not just in ounces and pounds, but in confidence in voice. Their spirits were mending with each act of agency, each regained shred of dignity, each choice they were now allowed to make for themselves. The scale, once an instrument of stark, dehumanizing measurement, now felt different to Morrison. He still saw the numbers, yes, the cold, hard data of their physical recovery, but he also saw the stories behind them, the unquantifiable resilience that defied the grim statistics, the sheer, tenacious will to live that no scale could ever measure. The weight of a life was not just in its mass, but in its spirit. Years later, Sergeant Frank Morrison, now a civilian doctor in a quiet American suburb, specializing in community health, would sometimes find his thoughts drifting back to Los Baños. The smell of boiling rice from a local Asian restaurant, or the distant rumble of thunder on a summer evening, could trigger vivid memories of the oppressive Philippine heat, the desperate faces, the quiet defiance of the women. He'd read an article in a medical journal once about the long-term psychological impacts of extreme starvation and trauma, and he'd scoffed internally, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. They were missing the point entirely. They were measuring the wrong things, focusing on symptoms when the true story was about something deeper. One evening, flipping through a newspaper over his evening coffee, a small photo caught his eye. An elderly woman, frail but with an unmistakable spark in her eyes, accepting an award for her decades of human rights advocacy, Eleanor Vance. The caption spoke of her tireless work with survivors of conflict and famine across the globe, her insistence on dignity and self-determination as crucial components of healing. He recognized the quiet strength, the unwavering spirit that had first bloomed in that sweltering triage tent in 1945, the strength that had allowed her to stand, barely 72 pounds, and yet refuse to be dismissed. The memory of the women, their collective will, their refusal to be merely victims echoed in his own life choices, subtly influencing his patient care, his belief in the inherent strength of the human spirit to overcome, to adapt, to choose. He learned that true healing was never just about the body, it was about the soul, about reclaiming what had been lost, about finding the power to choose, to define oneself, even in the face of absolute devastation. It was a lesson he carried with him every day, a silent testament to the power of human dignity. In the crucible of starvation, true resilience wasn't just about how much you weighed, but how much you refused to lose, how fiercely you clung to the essence of yourself. What hidden strengths lie within us, waiting for the darkest moments to be revealed? Explore more untold stories of courage and human spirit from World War II. Hit that subscribe button if you want to discover the true weight of history.